Today I'm diving into a totally new experiment for me, using gouache in a coloring book for the first time. Recently, Meeden offered to send me some of their art supplies, including a watercolor set, a watercolor block, and a 24 gouache set. As someone who already enjoys working on Meeden watercolor paper, I was genuinely thrilled to try more of their products. The watercolors will get their own dedicated video soon, where I'll create a beginner-friendly artwork. But today I wanted to focus only on gouache, and I'm really excited about that. Many colorists have asked whether I use gouache since my usual materials sometimes give similar effects. Now that I finally have gouache, I'm eager to explore how it compares to watercolors and acrylic markers. Before jumping into the coloring book, I tested the paints on a small piece of watercolor paper to feel out the texture and opacity and see how they behave. And after that little test, I went straight into painting. For this video, I chose a magical page from Johanna Basford's Worlds of Wonders, a whimsical treehouse castle, and I'll be exploring it with recognizable fantasy colors, the kind that drift between deep blues, bright teals, purples, magentas, and touches of emerald. Everyone approaches painting differently. Some people start with the most interesting section, but I want a piece to feel cohesive. This means thinking about how the colors interact. Since gouache is opaque and can easily cover layers below, I don't want to begin with a tree and castle in the foreground. Starting with these could later hide important details. So I'm starting with the background. I'm using a light blue shade first to begin building toward the deep blue and purple look I want. My aim is a mysterious forest, painted in luminous blue tones. This will give the scene a gentle glow and let me add darker, shadowy trees in the background later. As for the technique, I'm trying to use as little water as possible so I don't damage the coloring book paper. But everything feels great for now and paper still stays the same. Gouache works best when it's slightly thinned, just enough to glide smoothly across the background. For this first layer, I'm experimenting with a round brush size 6 and it's working quite well so far. I also noticed that this base layer looks the nicest when applied smoothly, which you can easily achieve with a medium flat brush. If you're wondering which brushes are the best for gouache, I honestly don't know yet. I'm using my watercolor brushes because I didn't have time to prepare anything else, and they're doing the job for now, but I will definitely need to get proper gouache brushes soon, so I don't ruin the watercolor ones. As always, everything I use is listed in the video description. Now I'm adding a darker blue to the top area. This is where I want more darkness. Deepening the background at the edges helps keep the main focus on the tree and the castle. Think of it as gently shaping the whole scene so it frames the tree cohesively. Gouache dries fairly quickly, but if your page is still damp on one side, it's best to use a hairdryer before moving on to the second layer. Now we can start adding the trees in a darker blue tone. I personally like to mix in a touch of deep purple here and there, not too much, just a few drops of color to break the monotony. This is only the background, so everything should stay simple and not too detailed. These trees are far in the distance and the main focus will be on our treehouse castle, so it's better to paint the background trees as soft silhouettes. They can even be slightly blurred. Use more water for this part, and if you add too much color, dab it gently with a clean paper towel. Just be careful with the paper. Try to shape the trees in a style that fits Johanna's illustration, slightly twisted trunks, a few thicker branches here and there, and pay attention to their size. Some trees can be darker and thicker to show that they're a bit closer, while others should be very thin and light to suggest depth and a dense forest behind everything. I'll also add a few bushes in bluish-purple tones in the foreground. As you start painting elements closer to the main tree, make your gouache less diluted and more opaque. This helps create a sense of dimension. The way you dilute the paint is just as important as the shapes you paint. And don't worry if your trees don't look perfect at the beginning. My first background trees looked terrible, but nobody ever noticed them once the central motif was finished. Just enjoy this stage and play with the shapes. Now it's time to work on the main tree. I'm starting with the branches and leaves, following Johanna's lines, using mostly purple tones. The way Johanna designed the shapes makes it very easy to focus on one cluster at a time, feel the shape with color first, and think about details later if needed. When I look at each little section, I like placing a slightly darker purple on the lower part and a lighter shade on the upper part. I'm pretending the light is coming from above, maybe from the moon, but really it just gives the tree a nicer balance. At first, I tried tapping the brush to create a textured leaf effect, but it ended up looking too busy for my taste. I personally prefer a softer, more elegant, dreamy look. So instead, I lightly wet my brush and go over the painted leaves with gentle circular motions. This blends everything into a smoother finish. You still get the feel of a soft cluster of leaves without needing to define each one. You don't even need visible leaf texture for this style. The overall shapes already tell the viewer what kind of tree it is. And honestly, I think it looks much more beautiful this way. Let's move on to the trunk. Here I'm mixing the colors a bit more again, adding touches of emerald and greenish tones. I also experimented with how much water the gouache can take and how transparent it can get, so I played with both thicker and more diluted layers. In the darkest hidden areas, I added deeper blues and purples, and on the parts of the trunk that should feel closer to us, I use slightly warmer greens and lighter magenta. It's not a strict rule or anything, but warmer colors can sometimes create a nice sense of depth and make the shape feel a bit more three-dimensional, almost as if the trunk is twisting forward and the part with the door is visually closer. That's how I arrange the colors here. For the little indents and grooves, I'm simply following Johanna's lines. This is the moment to use smaller detail brushes around sizes 0 to 3 if you want to get that wood texture with lots of thin lines without the brush dragging too much. And of course, don't forget to place the shadows in the right spots. They're what give the trunk its structure and help the whole form make sense. I'll leave the tiny leaf details for later. They're so small and I actually want to see how the castle will look first. Little things like that can either lift a section or make it feel too crowded, depending on how everything comes together. I usually prefer to paint the larger areas first and only add the final details once I understand the overall balance. So let's move on to the castle. The castle was definitely the most challenging part for me, and honestly, I had no idea what I was doing at first. With watercolors, it's easy to mix a soft gray and give a nice white castle look, but with gouache, my lack of experience showed immediately. I tried keeping the castle white with darker shadows, but it just wasn't working. Then I moved on to the roofs and tested a blue shade, which somehow looked even worse, so I abandoned the blue entirely and repainted everything in a deep magenta. Since everything else had been going surprisingly well, I really didn't expect the castle to give me such a headache, but painting it with gouache felt like a real pain at that point. I tried diluted gouache, I tried thicker gray layers. Nothing was behaving the way I wanted, so to help myself figure out the colors, I took some pencils and lightly tested different combinations right over the area. I knew I would cover everything with gouache later anyway, but the pencils helped me get a clearer direction. I added some shadows and darkened a few areas, and it started to look a bit better, but still relatively flat and dull. With gouache, I struggled to get those rounded three-dimensional tower shapes that come naturally to me with watercolor. I'm guessing this is simply a matter of learning the medium. Since the whole thing still felt too flat, I decided to add a bit of texture, something like stone or tiny bricks. Of course, painting individual bricks on such a small illustration would be way too much, so instead I used slightly diluted gouache, dabbed my brush on a paper towel and painted short broken strokes here and there, just enough to suggest a brick-like texture. In some areas, I added a little more definition, and in others, it felt too strong, so I used a wet, clean brush to soften or erase the excess texture. You don't need perfect detail here. These tiny parts can get overwhelming, and it isn't necessary. But adding just a hint of texture gave the castle a bit more charm, and I finally started to feel much happier with how it was turning out. Of course, I also added some light to the windows to brighten up the whole castle. I really enjoy bringing in warm yellow tones, even within this cool color palette. They give the scene a gentle warmth that I love unless I'm intentionally going for a colder mood. I also thinned the darker blues a little so I could add soft, transparent layers to the areas that sit more in the shadows. Now I'm left with the smaller leaves and flowers. There's a lot of purple at the top of the page and the bottom feels a little out of balance, so I'm adding touches of magenta to the leaves and flowers to bring everything together. I'll also add a bit of yellow to parts of the tree for the same reason. For the door, I'm going with warmer colors along with a warmer green in the front area. That should help create the feeling that this part is much closer to us than the castle, which sits further back in the scene. With that contrast, the tree should naturally feel more dimensional and slightly twisted in perspective. If you ask me, the green in the front feels a little too warm now, so I think I'll tone it down a bit to find a better balance. I'll use some diluted blue gouache to calm the colors that feel a bit too strong. I'll also give the upper purple area a finishing touch, brightening the leaves slightly with a vibrant pink and adding a few white highlights. To complete the picture inside the frame, I'll add some tiny flowers using light dotting. You don't need any advanced drawing skills for that. Just dot a few spots to suggest small flowers among the large tree. It instantly makes the space feel fuller, and for me, delicate little flowers always give the sense that something pleasant is happening here. For a touch of extra magic and shine, you can make a small white circle, gently blur it with your finger to soften it, and add a white dot in the center. It's a simple trick, but it creates a charming little effect that adds a touch of fantasy. Now all that's left is the frame. I already filled part of it with a black acrylic marker because it's simply faster and easier than struggling with brushes and gouache. I'm adding a bit of dark blue around the edges and deepening a few areas. I also wanted a small decorative touch, so I used metallic gold watercolor and a gel pen to add tiny leaf shapes. It's an easy way to make the frame feel a bit more special. I sprinkled in a few extra stars and darkened some lighter spots with colored pencils so the frame wouldn't compete with the main artwork. I really enjoyed my first proper try with gouache, and I can honestly say it works beautifully in coloring books. It doesn't bleed through and it doesn't warp the paper, or at least a lot less than watercolor would. I'm definitely excited to use it again. The Meeden colors, as you saw, are vibrant, blend nicely, and dry to a lovely matte finish. They were easy to work with and mixed well with other mediums. If you haven't tried gouache yet, Meeden is a great and affordable option, and you might really enjoy using it in coloring books. I'll be making a Meeden watercolor video soon, so you can see how those paints perform too. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to support the channel, feel free to leave a like or a comment. It helps more than you think. See you in the next tutorial.